All right, so you might be wondering, where does all this money printing come from? Well, it comes from the Federal Reserve Bank, otherwise known as the Fed. And ironically enough, the Fed is not a bank, it's not federal, it has no reserves, and it's a private institution. Most people for sure don't know it's a private institution. They see the word federal and they just go, oh, it's part of our government. It's actually not. It's like a handful of dudes that basically run all of the banks in the United States. And as I said, it's not a bank, it's not federal, and it has no reserves. Meaning they have no reserves means they just print money out of thin air. They create it every day or however much they want, and then they loan it to you and me through local banks. And then we, the taxpayer, pay them interest on our debt. So not only when you go get like a loan or something from a bank, the money was just created out of thin air. And what the interest really is, because you're paying them in paper dollars, which are worthless, is your blood, sweat, and tears are being paid to the head of the Federal Reserve, which is this guy right here, Mr. Ben Bernanke, otherwise known as Helicopter Ben. I don't know if you can see this picture that well, but he's in a helicopter here, and he's literally throwing paper dollars out of a helicopter. And he gave a speech a while ago that said, should there be a big downturn in the U.S., he would just print as much money as needed and would flood the system with money to help keep it going, essentially. As I've kind of hopefully proven to you throughout history, that only works in the short run until it eventually collapses. The one thing going for Mr. Bernanke, though, is this sweet beard he has. I'm actually pretty jealous of it. It's always very well groomed. But that's it. Okay, government stats here. Unemployment. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. So the reason the unemployment number is false and it's always higher than stated, believe it or not, so as our current crisis gets worse and worse, you turn on the TV and the TV says, oh, unemployment dropped to 8 or 9%, and you sit there and you think to yourself, what are you talking about? Like, I know I have a lot of friends who are unemployed, or my neighbor's unemployed, but the reason unemployment goes down is people that have been on unemployment benefits for a certain amount of time, once they drop off, they become what they are considered unemployable, and they just drop off the statistics. So if you have, let's say there's only 10 people in the United States and 5 of them become, quote, unemployable, that means there's only 5 people left in the workforce. And if, say, all 5 of them are working, then you have, as far as the government is concerned, 100% employment. So one way, there's different websites out there. One is called shadowstats.com. That has it roughly about 15% or more. And once again, it moves around daily. But basically, a thing I've kind of noticed, whatever the government number is, just double it, and you can get the real level of unemployment. GDP. So a lot of time you will hear, oh, it's okay that the U.S. has as much debt as we do. Right now, I believe it's at the stated amount is 16 trillion, which is also a bit of a myth. It's actually well over 100 trillion when you include unfunded liabilities, but it's getting pretty technical, and I'm not going to get into that. But so the reason GDP is basically fudged, anytime our government prints money or anything like that, if you don't know what GDP is, it's gross domestic product. Just kind of think of it as, if you're thinking of the government as your family, it'd just be the household income that comes in, and GDP goes up anytime we print money or anytime something is bought, whatever, sold. Basically, anytime a transaction takes place, that is added to GDP, which shows that there's growth going on in the U.S. So, and once again, that's the very tip of the iceberg. But the reason it's false, take flooding as example. I lived in the Midwest for a while, and they had, I think it was early 2000, I don't remember the year, they had massive flooding where there was hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. There was all kinds of cornfields damaged, housing, cities, everything were underwater. And anytime you have something like that where there's damage taking place and it's a negative number, basically, once again, if you're viewing it as your household, it'd be like one of your spouse or something loses their job, you would look at it as a negative, but not GDP and government numbers. So if you have flooding and there's all kinds of damage, they don't subtract that. But what they do include is all the aid that would come in from other states. So like Iowa had all kinds of flooding, and when California sent an aid package to Iowa, let's say they sent them $15 million to help a city that lost $80 billion. the 80 billion doesn't get subtracted, but the 15 million gets added to GDP. So then you have all these economists that say, oh, it's okay to have as much debt as we do because our GDP is outpacing debt. But when your GDP is a false number, then your debt becomes unsustainable, and that's what's going on in Greece right now, and why they're having such a massive collapse. The last one here is inflation. This is super important. Inflation is literally just the increase in base money, which is printing money. Just think of it, inflation is just printing money. And the way the government calculates it, again, they understate it because they don't include food and energy into it. So they print all this money, and the price of food and energy, which you and I use every day, we can see it going up. It's like you go to the gas station, it goes up. You go out to a restaurant, like going out and have a sandwich, it's like $12 now at a restaurant. It's ridiculous, right? But the Federal Reserve doesn't include that in their inflation statistics because they say it's too volatile. Which once again is completely ridiculous. So they underrepresent it. They say it currently is about 2 or 3%, when in reality it's closer to like 8, 9, or 10. Going to touch more on inflation here. So you have 4 episodes of Fed money printing, which is, as I kind of mentioned earlier too, is QE. It's known as quantitative easing. It's my personal opinion. They call it stuff like that, so that when you hear that, you immediately your eyes just roll back in your head and your tongue falls out of your mouth and you're like, what? But yeah, so these are fancy words for money printing. So you can see here Y2K, basically .com, boom, all kinds of money being printed. The stock market went crazy. Right after 9/11, printed a bunch of money. But after 2008 here with the housing collapse, you can see here we got huge influx of dollars being printed in quantitative easing 1. This right here is also the same time the stock market bottomed, as I talked about during the Germany example. It coincides with the U.S. stock market going up. And then you have quantitative easing 2, which has actually just recently come to an end. This chart is once again a little dated, but I'm waiting for QE3, so it'll be off our screen. The next big quantitative easing, which may not be called quantitative easing, but whatever it is, will be the biggest, in my opinion, the biggest or the largest round of money printing the U.S., most likely the world, has ever seen. So here's a guy that I respect, James Turk. And he's just talking about the monetary base, which is inflation again. And I'm going to read this to you. So it says it took 200 years for the monetary base to go from 0 to 800 billion. But in the past 3 months, it's grown from around 800 billion to 1.5 trillion. And by the time you read this, it'll probably be surpassing 1.6 trillion. That's double the number of paper dollars in existence since last summer. So what does inflation do? Once again, I've said it a few times here, but when you start printing money, it chases after things that have a finite supply, and it forces the prices of those things to go up. So this is just through 2000 here. First one, I don't know if you can see that, but it's cotton. The price of cotton has gone up 167%. Silver up 109%. Corn up 82%. Coffee, which I have pretty much every day, up 80%. All the way down here, gold up 27%. All the way at the bottom here to natural gas. I don't know why that one's going down so much. They keep finding more of it, but it's irrelevant. As you can see, everything else is going up. And this is all energy, right, for the most part. And once again, the Federal Reserve doesn't include this in their inflation statistics. So if you want to go buy a shirt, even though the shirt's gone up 167%, our government will tell you that, oh yeah, that's not true. That didn't really happen. So, price of gold and where I think it's headed. This is just a steady increase, right? So I have a lot of people that I talk about, that I try to get them to buy gold, family members, friends, mostly, and they go, oh, it's too expensive, it just keeps going up, it's ridiculous, it's a bubble. I can go into all kinds of stuff on that, but once again, if you remember from earlier, gold is simply trying to track the amount of dollars in circulation. It doesn't lie, it doesn't report to anybody, it's not a company. It's only going up because of the amount of dollars that are in circulation. So as you look for QE1 and QE2 in that previous chart, gold is just following suit. So if you think the U.S. is going to stop printing money and all of our problems are solved, then yeah, you probably don't want to buy gold. Otherwise, you want to be buying it hand over fist, in my opinion. Also, one other note to that, bubbles only happen when everybody thinks it's a good idea. If you remember the housing bubble or the tech bubble, I personally am one of the few people, even though I've been talking about this for years, I'm one of the only people I know that owns the stuff. And here's where I think it's headed. That's a rocket ship, and it's going to go to the moon. Yeah, that's the extent of my Photoshop abilities.